welcome everybody to our series, CESI Inside. We're having short interviews with different stakeholders, researchers, politicians, and from our member organizations. Today, we have Daphne Ahrendt with us. Daphne, I'm very, very pleased to have you today. You're Senior Research Manager at Eurofound, the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. And you have made an extensive research during the whole month of April. I think you had 85,000 respondents to that research. Daphne, can you a little bit explain to us what were the general findings of that study?
Yeah, sure, my pleasure. Indeed, we had over 80,000 people participate. We had actually 62,000 something people that completed the questionnaire. And so that's what we base our responses on. And what we find is a pretty stark picture of people's lives across the EU. So we see that a lot of people have lower than what we typically find on other surveys levels of well-being and optimism. There's a growing sense of insecurity. Many people, close to 40%, report difficulties making ends meet. People are worried about the future ahead. And then we really saw pretty dramatic decreases in working time and coupled with job losses permanently or at least temporarily. So one side of the story. The other side of the story, what we also asked about in our survey is how did people deal with work? So we see that teleworking really did take off in all countries. But what does that mean? It means that children were at home, creches were closed, so it put a real strain on people with families. I think at the same time, it's important to say that at least the people that could telework were able to keep their jobs. And I don't know what they would have done if they couldn't telework. So it's in that sense, it probably avoided even more financial hardship, how difficult it may have been for these families to combine working and having not only the children at home, but also responsibilities for homeschooling. So I think you could say that it's been a significant strain on families to cope. Maybe the other thing to say that this survey is just the beginning. So this was our first wave, and we're planning now a second wave that will go into the field on June 10th. And hopefully in the second wave, we'll also be able to follow up. So part of our study is a panel. So we want to see how the situation of people changes. But we're also going to include some further questions about teleworking, but also about people that didn't have the opportunity to telework. Are these people in essential jobs? Did they receive protective gear? How safe did they feel? So it will be interesting to monitor the survey as we go in a different period, also where countries are now, as you said, leaving the full lockdown, and let's see what that then means.
Definitely, when you look also at the mental well-being index of the WHO, and you have especially the lowest indexes are found, for instance, in countries like Greece, Italy. Spain is quite down. Is there a direct link, you think, between, let's say, the levels of infections on the one hand and the real feeling, well-being feeling, or are there further underlying reasons for that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think yes and no. I think it's a bit early to tell. So what we know is that this is a health crisis that has a huge impact on the economy and on the labor market. And it's a bit speculative at the moment, but countries like Spain and Italy that were hardest hit perhaps also had more underlying problems, but France at the same time didn't particularly have those. So I find it difficult to speculate at this stage. What we did recently look more in depth at Italy, and what you really see there, it's a huge societal crisis. So it's impacting on every aspect of life across Italy. And if you look at the EU figures and you compare the Italian results, they're way worse. So in Italy, I have to look, 34% of respondents lost their jobs either permanently or temporarily. 21% are afraid that they might lose their job compared to 16% EU average. 46% think this financial situation will get worse. 42% say that. 17% say they have problems paying their bills. So, this is really strong evidence of the vast implications of what this pandemic is doing to the Italian labor market and to Italian society. Again, I think it will hit all European member states. There were Dutch results now that the increase in unemployment or the increase in requests for unemployment benefits has not been this high since 2003. I think it's going to be a huge blow for Europe in general. And sure, countries where infection rates were less and where there was less of a slowdown, they will feel probably less pain.
Frightening figures indeed. Daphne, you also have, I would say, there's a very clear age dimension also in the figures you have received, and I came across some interesting, from my perspective, interesting findings. On the one hand, the study comes to the conclusion that optimism basically decreased with increasing age. On the other side, people age 50 or over had higher mental well-being. Now we know that the young people are particularly hit, also not only, I would say, economically, but also mentally. I think you speak a lot also about isolation. I mean, the impacts of isolation, which do not only concern older or elderly people, but of course also the young. Can you explain a little bit what the particularly impacts are maybe on the different age sections and why there might be maybe slight contradictions?
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish the question. So what we found on the question whether you are more optimistic about your future is that young people score better than older people, but when it comes to risk of depression or loneliness, young people did less well. And I think it's important to distinguish the question. So the question about the future is where we typically find that young people are more optimistic because they have a future ahead of them. They can't maybe look that far ahead, and they don't have that much comparison to base things on. But I also think it's important to say that these were early results, and maybe during the period where we looked at the data or where we collected data, for young people, it was still mainly a health crisis that wasn't yet affecting them directly. In that sense, they didn't see their future affected. So, as you say, we did find that when it came to the well-being index and when it came to feeling lonely, young people didn't respond as positively. And that's really unusual. So normally we have young people optimistic and more positive on all these measures. So what we think we're finding at this stage is, as you already say, that for young people, this experience of lockdown has been particularly difficult, not being able to go out and seeing their friends, not being able to socialize, probably impacts harder on them than on older people who may have more experience of loneliness anyways. At the same time, I think that this higher level of optimism, even the question about the future, it will change. I think once the economic impact of the crisis becomes more evident, and young people begin to realize that possibly after the lockdown is finished, they cannot return to their jobs. So it's not a temporary situation, that then the results will be different. And what we do know from the previous crisis is that it is the young people that were hit hardest, because they tend to be in the jobs that go first, in the flexible temporary jobs. And so in the previous crisis, or after the previous crisis, youth unemployment, as you know, skyrocketed, particularly in countries like Italy and Spain and Greece, where we saw percentages above 40%, or proportions above 40%. So I'm worried about that, and I think it's important that we focus on these groups, and that we take the lessons that we learned from the previous crisis, and that's why it's important to monitor now these developments.
Yeah, indeed. Not very worrying trends, and especially for our young people. Now, we also hear in the study, which I thought was quite interesting, the trust in the European Union level. And there also, when you have a look at the figures, you have the feeling there's still some kind of aftermath of the 2008-2009 crisis, which is almost tangible in the results. Do you see that the same? I see Finland on top, I see Greece, Spain, Italy again quite low, surprisingly also France extremely low. Do you have any explanations for that?
Yeah, I think it's important to not forget, as bad as the results look, that we looked at the Eurobarometer from 2019, and the order of the countries is more or less the same. So also in 2019, France had a relatively low level of trust in the EU. Italy also is low. Spain is somewhat higher. And also in our survey, we find Spain somewhat higher. So the ranking of the countries is more or less the same. What has changed is that the EU is now more the scapegoat than the national governments. So up until this pandemic started, we actually saw support in the EU increasing again. And the Eurobarometer that I just referred to found highest levels of trust in the EU for a long time. I think since the previous crisis, trust in the EU hadn't been so high. And it's a very disappointing finding, I think, for the EU, because I think they actually acted quite rapidly, and yesterday the Council adopted the SURE program with over 100 billion in support measures, and allowing member states that particularly need the funds to have access to it. So in my personal assessment, I think that at the moment people are voicing their frustration more at the amount of arguing perhaps that there's been between member states on how to get these funds set up than directly at the EU itself taking action. So it's more perceptions of discontent between countries, and that's possibly something we could measure But I think that's what you're seeing here.
Also, which is, of course, I mean, this is nothing new. This is to be expected, and this is the particularly worrying part. You come to the very strong and clear conclusion that there is a general trend towards less work and less income, and I think 5%. We speak here of the April figures have, according to your results, have lost their jobs. 23% are in temporary, let's say, unemployment. You will continue with the studies, and you are probably already collecting you have collected a lot of figures for the month of May. What can be expected? Will this trend be even sharpened, or is there some kind of trend which is foreseeable now for the month of May and for the coming months? I very much hope that Eurofound would continue this, because this is extremely valuable data also for, how could I say, decision makers in whatever institutions or trade union. This is very important. So what do you think? What will the trend? In which direction will the trend point?
Well, we are starting the second wave in June, as I said. At the moment, we are we haven't analyzed the next batch of questions or of responses, but my guess is that the results are not going to improve, so that as people realize how big this actually is, they will realize it personally, because they're not returning to jobs. That's what my fear is, that after the lockdown ends, the restrictive measures are still there. It's not like the restaurants and bars and pubs can reopen. So that realization is going to show in the results, but also the number of people that lose their job. I think what we'll see is increases in inactive, that people aren't even looking for jobs because they know they're just not there. Again, it's anecdotal, but in the Netherlands, if you apply for unemployment benefit, temporary unemployment benefit, you usually are requested to look for work. They've now stopped that. That requirement is currently not there because they know there aren't any jobs out there. And what I really think is important, and where we are concerned, is that in the years after the crisis, and particularly in the last 2 years or so, things were looking very good. So unemployment was lower and lower, and I mean, we were hitting the roof again with growth. But that's not showing really what's underneath some of these developments, because what we also found is that there were particularly in some countries increases in non-standard employment, and we have vulnerable self-employed groups who are more likely to be at risk of poverty and are not as well protected against impacts of economic shock. So what I'm worried about is that you will find perhaps again an opportunity for greater inequality, so that the people that are hit or that are more vulnerable to being hit will also really feel it harder, and that's a concern. And I think it's important to monitor these particular groups. So to look at people with flexible employment arrangements, or to also look at countries where this is more prevalent. And when you're looking at these countries, you're not just talking about your typical divide, north, south, west, east. The Netherlands is a country where flex working or platform type jobs are very popular, and where, yes, the things are being done to ensure that they are better protected. It's one of the lessons that we did learn from the previous crisis, to ensure that social protection is there, but that social protection will now be needed.
Can you say just a little bit more, because this is we just spoke also about the young persons particularly hit. Now you also said, of course, I mean, this is self-evident, and this will be a major challenge for societies, for social protection systems, but also I think we as trade unions are particularly called here also upon to ensure a seamless as possible representation of the most vulnerable ones. But can you say, especially when you speak about atypical work or non-standard work, can you say they are seasonal workers, or are they migrant workers, atypical workers? What are those, according to the findings of the study, which might be or which are the most at risk? Can you say something a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so I can differentiate. Our survey indicates that people, obviously not surprising, that lost their jobs are most at risk. But we don't yet know who lost their job, right? We didn't specifically ask whether they had, what kind of contract they had. But what we also see is that self-employed are most at risk. And I mean, if you look at our fact sheet, some of the results are really, really quite daunting. For some categories, you see proportions in the 80-70% range where people are concerned. What I was referring to earlier, so we did a study, we wrote a report, labor market change, trend and policy approaches towards flexibilization, and there we see an increasing number of people with what we call non-standard work. So that would be people that work part-time, people that have flexible temporary contracts, 0-hour contracts, and then also people, platform workers, for instance, where there's no good system of social protection available, where you actually don't really know what the rules and regulations are for this group. It's new employment where we don't know enough about it yet. But I mean, you don't have to be particularly smart to think that the person with 0 hours, with a contract of 0 hours, is the first that's going to be told, well, we have no work for you. And that's what I think we are seeing now in this increase in unemployment. So if 1 and 1 is 2, you see that more people have lost their job. These people have difficulties making ends meet. But who are these people? I think you can quite safely say that these are the people with the weakest employment protection systems.
And how do you see trade unions at this moment? Are they, according to you, particularly important? Are they, what is the role? I mean, we define our role very, very clearly, but very often it's also important to not only define this role yourself, but also to listen to other forces in the society. What is the crucial, decisive role, importance at this moment for trade unions?
Yeah, I think it's a question that you're probably better able to answer than I am. But I think that the role of the trade unions is there now to ensure that in discussions with other stakeholders, with governments and with employers, you are in a good position to remind them of the risks we have if we don't act quickly, if we don't ensure that those people most at risk receive protection. And, you know, in a way, I think that this time we are somewhat better prepared than last time. because last time we didn't know. And even though this crisis came completely unexpected, nobody was, of course, expecting a crisis in March 2020, when in February 2020 we were showing great results. But we did learn from the previous crisis, and the European Union, or the new Commission, with the European pillar of social rights, to which they had committed to ensure that social protection measures are put in place to guide member states to ensure that these are areas that attention is paid to, and to look at the development of precarious work and to see what does this mean. And so that's where the trade unions have a role, to remind them, well, what it means is that the risk of unemployment is there, and that the numbers will grow quickly, because these people don't even have to be fired. Their job just ceases.
And Daphne, is a final question to you. If you had in these difficult times one wish.
One wish only.
One wish only. What would it be?
Well, I think I thought about it. The obvious answer would be a vaccine, but that's everybody's wish. So my wish really is that we learn, or take the lessons that we learned from the previous recession, and that we act quickly, and that we ensure that we don't again run the risk of losing a generation of people. And what I wanted to say really is, I think it is the young people that are very much at risk. These are the people that hold these flexible jobs, these temporary jobs, or these new forms of employment. You will find fewer old people there. Not in any way, by the way, taking away the risks that they face. If you are older and you are on a flexible 0-hour contract, then your situation is also extremely harsh. But if you look at the numbers, it's often more likely that these are young people. And for them to again have to go through another generation, or another, I don't know how many years of climbing back up, of having to live at home until you're 30 again, I don't think that is a recipe for a very optimistic future.
Daphne, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and all the best to you. Take care of yourself, and say hi to all the colleagues at Eurofound.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.